Welcome back to the podcast for our first holiday episode. We're so excited to be back with you all. This year has been a year of change for the podcast. We premiered our new seasonal structure, which started off with Season 1, titled Taking Back the Narrative. That season centered impacted communities by giving them the microphone to tell their stories in the ways they wanted them to be told. Then we premiered Season 2, The Shadow of Oppenheimer, which brought back this style of storytelling while also highlighting the backstory when the Oppenheimer film was released this summer. This focus reminds us, more than ever, that we cannot talk about nuclear weapons issues without clearly stating that nuclear weapons are a human rights issue. The most profound example of the dangers of nuclear weapons remain how many people have been negatively impacted by nuclear weapons and continue to be impacted to this day. What happened in places like Los Alamos, Hanford, and Oak Ridge is not unique. This just happens in the dark. And this is why it's so important that we continue to bring these stories to light, and why we will continue to keep doing this as long as nuclear weapons continue to impact people.
My name's Mary Dickson. I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I am a Downwinder. I've been working to expand RECA and to bring attention to the plight of downwinders for at least 30 years. Nuclear weapons have been a huge part of my life. They've informed my life, my outlook, my work. I was a victim of nuclear weapons testing that was done above ground in the years that I was growing up. And I don't know if most people know this, but children are the most vulnerable to the effects of nuclear weapons fallout. So I was one of those unfortunate children. People might not know as well, you don't always get sick right away. In fact, research now shows that exposure can cause you to develop cancer at any point during your lifetime. So you're never really free of being afraid. I got thyroid cancer, which is a cancer they know is linked to radioactive fallout. I was 29 when I was diagnosed. I had to have my thyroid removed, some lymph nodes around it, and then they gave me radioactive iodine to drink to get rid of whatever was left, which always struck me as very odd. I had a sign on my hospital bracelet, the radiation symbol. I had the same symbol on my door. They wouldn't come into my room. The nurses would just open the door and slide in the trays of food. And every day a doctor would come and hold up a Geiger counter to see how hot I was. And I couldn't leave the hospital until the readings were low enough. And then I was warned not to be around pregnant women or small children for a while and not to get pregnant for at least a year. And it turned out I never could get pregnant because, as often happens with people who had my cancer, my treatment, you end up developing fertility problems. I had to have a hysterectomy later in my life. In my 30s, in fact, so I never did have kids. So that is basically my story. And then as someone who was older, I never considered that it might be linked to testing. I didn't know that. I just thought I was very unlucky. And the more I found out, the more shocked I was. Anyway, I'm a writer, and I was asked to interview a woman who was collecting oral histories and taking photographs of downwinders around the West. And I was interviewing her, and when she was listing off all the cancers you could get from radioactive fallout exposure, I said, "Oh, thyroid cancer. I had thyroid cancer." And that's when she started interviewing me. She said, "When? Where'd you grow up? Did you drink milk?" And she asked me all these questions. And of course, I said, I grew up in Salt Lake. Yes, I drank milk. I'm always from the local dairy and sometimes from cows when we went to visit my grandfather. His friends had a farm. And she just said, "You're a downwinder." I said, No, I'm not. I grew up in Salt Lake, not Southern Utah, because there's this misperception that only people in Southern Utah developed cancer and other radiation-related illnesses. And that was not the case. The more I looked into it, the more I found out that my entire state got high levels of fallout, that not just my state, but the West, and sometimes all the way to the Midwest, which is our big agricultural belt, and sometimes all the way into upstate New York, which was documented, and even into Canada. I met an Air Force colonel who flew the planes to track fallout. And he told me about the times an underground test vented, they call it vented. It looked like an above ground test, and it blew and was measured in Canada, which violated international treaties. But our government never kind of fessed up to it, and the Canadians didn't push it. Anyway, the more I found out, the more alarmed I was. And I thought there are so many people across this country who have no idea that they're downwinders. They don't know why they got sick. And that to me, it's such a tragedy what happened to all of us. So that's why I began becoming an activist. I guess nothing makes you an activist faster than a diagnosis. And my sister and I started counting the people we grew up with who had cancer and other radiation-related illnesses. And in our 5-block area where we grew up, we counted 54 people. And to this day, I still meet people I grew up with who weren't on that list, but who have since developed cancers. So we know that we were a cluster. We grew up near a canyon, and canyon winds will blow that fallout back down at night. So we really got a double dose, but not just a double dose, because there were 100 above ground tests and 828 below ground tests. A lot of them vented. That nice euphemism. And we know that we experienced multiple exposures. It wasn't just one bomb, it was hundreds, literally hundreds of bombs. So that's what started me on my path to the work I do. And I mean, I worked full time all this time. I worked for PBS Utah for most of my career, and I did all this on the side. And I actually retired early about 4 years ago, just so I could devote all my time to doing this work, because I thought this is what I need to do. This is what's important. We've got to make sure people know what happened, and we have to make sure that those who were affected are compensated and recognized, and that justice is served, because our own government poisoned us. They bombed us literally, and they need to do right by us. I mean, I was also a contributing writer while I worked at the PBS station for a lot of different publications, and one of them just called me recently because it's their 40th anniversary, and they were interviewing people who had written for them. And the editor said, I was just going through old issues, and in 2004, you wrote about expanding the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And I just said, see, nothing changes. I'm still doing that. Look, 20 years later, I'm still working on this. And I think for me, I'm just driven by it. And every time I think I'm going to stop, I can't do this anymore, something happens and I get pulled back into it. And I think, okay, this is the work I have to do. I just have to do it. And I think the thing that keeps me going, and this is the truth, I have met so many absolutely incredible, remarkable people doing this work. They've become good friends. And I think if it weren't for all those people, and we bolster each other, we support each other, we cry to each other. And I think if it weren't for all those people, I probably wouldn't still be doing this work. About 4 years ago, I was lucky enough to, I don't know how I actually met her, Tina Cordova, who's a remarkable woman in New Mexico. And she and I started talking on the phone, and she had organized a group from various states that the new Radiation Exposure Compensation Act amendment would include. And we started meeting via Zoom once a week. And that group, not only were we strategizing, we became close friends, and it became a major support system for me. Just those weekly calls kept me going. I can't tell you, with every victory, with every defeat, I would get on the phone with Tina, and we would either hoot and cheer, or we would cry and say, we're going to keep going. We're going to keep going. It's not over till it's over. And those people were incredibly important, because this is very lonely work, especially where I am, because most of the people I work closely with in Utah, they've died. I'm like the last one of them left. And there are still people who are interested, and I try and keep them up to date on what's happening. But people who have time to do the hard work and have just the mental fortitude to do the hard work, there aren't that many. And so it's been a godsend for me to have these other people. And the other thing that happened along this whole journey that keeps me going are the national groups. Groups like Plowshares, groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists. There are so many groups who, even though they're not personally affected, these people have become the most incredibly important allies we could have. I mean, they know how things work nationally. They know how we should go and lobby Congress. They're there all along the way to help us. And without those people, I don't think we'd be where we are today. I think we wouldn't have the national visibility we have. I mean, I look at Lilly Adams, who's with the Union of Concerned Scientists, who organized another group, the RICA Working Group. And to this day, I can't remember how it all happened, but I think I am so lucky to have connected with her and all these other people across the country, and even some of them out of the country. And it's just been amazing, amazing to have that level of support and advocacy for us, because that's what gives me hope and that's what keeps me going. If I were just out here crying in the wilderness, and we wouldn't be very far, you know? You really need solidarity, and you need a group of good people who are dedicated and just never give up. And that's what we've got. What's really interesting to me is how this whole fight for RICA expansion has developed, because it started with Mike Crapo of Idaho introducing an amendment. And then Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico joined in, and that became this really powerful group. They were pushing for it. They introduced in the 117th Congress bills in the House and Senate, and we were able to get like 75 co-sponsors in the House and something like 24, 25 in the Senate. I mean, that was amazing progress, but it never came to the floor for a vote. So they were reintroduced in the 118th Congress. And all of a sudden, I get this call from Lilly saying, you'll never believe this, but Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, has introduced that amendment as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. And we're thinking, what? Josh Hawley, how did this happen? I mean, things started moving so fast. I think that was last August. They just started moving really fast. Well, there's a group of women, very strong, again, great advocates in Missouri, and they discovered that their area of St. Louis was where they stored nuclear waste from the Manhattan Project. It got into the creek. The creek flooded. It got into their homes. It was stored near an elementary school. They had to close that school. And these women went to Josh Hawley, and he listened to them, not just listened, but he became their champion. So that's how Missouri, that part of Missouri, got added to the RICA amendment. And I tell you, I haven't seen anybody push as hard as Josh Hawley has pushed. I mean, politics makes strange bedfellows, and there's this conservative Republican who's just gone the extra mile to push for this. And right now, it did pass the Senate. In the NDAA, it was included in the Senate version of the NDAA, just as the bill was written. And that was strong bipartisan support. That happened in September. And you could imagine how high tensions are right now, because if this doesn't go through, RICA, the current RICA, expires at the end of June, which means nobody gets the help they need anymore, even the people who now qualify. I just think it's really time our government do the right thing and take care of the people they've harmed. You know, we invest over since the Manhattan Project, we've invested over $12 trillion in nuclear weapons. And what this amount would be to help the people who suffered the most is so minuscule in comparison to that budget. And what really, I think, gets me is that there are plans right now to spend another $1.5 trillion on upgrading our arsenal and creating a really super powerful nuclear weapon. And if there's that kind of money to build more weapons of mass destruction, which, by the way, will also mean more production, people around those sites getting sick. It will also mean they've got to test them, more people downwind getting ill. If there's that kind of money to still invest in these weapons, the whole notion that there's not enough to help the people those weapons have harmed, to me, is utterly absurd and immoral. So I think if you're going to make those weapons part of our national defense, though they are weapons that can never be used, part of that cost is the cost of those they've harmed. I think one thing people can do, and it's a thing we've been telling people to do, is to reach out to Senator McConnell's office, to reach out to Representative Johnson's office and let them know this is the right thing to do. This is the will of the people. This is doing what you need to do right now, and you can't wait. You can't put it off. You can't say, well, there's not enough money, because that argument just absolutely does not hold up. So I would say they need to hear from a lot of people. Call their offices. You might not reach them. In fact, chances are you will not reach them. Leave a message, email them, reach out to them, let them know that this is the right thing to do, and then reach out to your own representatives and say whatever you can do to pressure them to make sure this goes through. It's just absolutely the right thing to do. It's so interesting. People will say, well, it's just me. It's just my one voice. They're not going to listen to me. But I'll tell you, there's great power in hearing from people. I remember meeting with a senator once when we were lobbying, and he said, sometimes it only takes 10 calls for me to know I better pay attention to an issue. 10 calls, that's nothing, So I say to anyone who thinks you won't make a difference, don't underestimate your own power. Make the call, because enough calls, and they do listen. They know it's an issue that concerns people. If they hear from people all over the country, they know this matters.
And now it's more important than ever. On July 27th, the U.S. Senate voted to expand RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, to include more people affected by U.S. nuclear testing, including downwinders in New Mexico and workers in the uranium mining industry after 1971. This vote passed 86-11, which reinforced that RECA is a bipartisan issue and continues to garner bipartisan support. Before this legislation to pass, the House would need to approve it in the NDAA. And for those who might not know, the NDAA is the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the Department of Defense's annual budget. Despite strong bipartisan support, with advocates like Senator Josh Hawley and Senator Ben Ray Lujan urging their colleagues to keep RECA in the NDAA, so it did not expire in 2024, it was not included in the most recent version, which is now advanced to the House Rules Committee for further action. It still requires approval in the House and Senate. This means that bipartisan supporters in both chambers are working on ways to ensure that RECA is included in the final version of the NDAA. This is an ongoing and tiring process, which is why we're talking to Lilly Adams about it. She is a senior outreach coordinator at the Union of Concerned Scientists and a tireless advocate for this community. But first, here's a message from Terry Gamble-Boyer.
Hi, I'm Terry Gamble-Boyer. I'm the board chair and a proud supporter of Plowshares Fund. Here at Plowshares, it is our fundamental belief that everyone, everywhere, has a right to live in a safe, secure, and free world, one free of the threat of nuclear weapons. As the only fund focused solely on reducing nuclear threats, Plowshares is unique. We are working not only to reduce these threats, but also to elevate the voices of those already affected by nuclear weapons, as you have heard throughout this year's podcast episodes. All of this work is made possible by our supporters. You can help us continue this important work by donating today at plowshares.org/donate.
And we're back with Lilly Adams to help us learn more about what else can be done to support those impacted by nuclear weapons.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. My name is Lilly Adams. I'm a senior outreach coordinator in the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So I think folks probably are familiar with a Senate vote earlier this year in late summer when Senator Hawley introduced an amendment along with Senator Lujan and Senator Crapo to the NDAA to, significantly strengthen and extend RICA. That vote was a very successful bipartisan vote of, I think, 61 to 37. There were quite a few Republican senators who voted in favor. So that was, a very incredible moment. And then that was followed up also by a really powerful press conference held by all of the bill sponsors, where, again, these bipartisan members came together to say we have this bipartisan support, we can pass this. So I think that was sort of the high point of the year, maybe, when this passed the Senate and seemed like there was really a path to finally making these amendments become law. And then, as we all know, there was quite a bit of turmoil in Congress after that. And I think part of what happened is that, Congress kind of started getting short on time as less and less was able to get done while everything was totally disrupted by, speaker changes and getting up to expiring budgets. And so then when we got to the conference process for the NDAA, it kind of just became this behind the scenes negotiation with leadership. We had some really significant wins even at that time as well. We found out that Chairman Jim Jordan of the House Judiciary Committee cleared the RICA amendments, gave his thumbs up. The House and Senate Armed Services Committees gave their thumbs up. So there were a lot of really good indications along the way. Congress was supportive of this. But ultimately, what we've heard is that it came down to a decision by Speaker Johnson and Minority Leader McConnell, who kind of behind the scenes said, no, thank you. And that led us to where we are now, where this was actually taken out of the NDAA, despite all of that, bipartisan support that had been building over the last few months. So yeah, extremely disappointing, but, of course, we're reorganizing and gearing up for next year to keep fighting another day. So this is not the first time that we've seen this happen, unfortunately. So last year in the NDAA, there was a smaller amendment introduced on RICA that would just have expanded the apology section of the legislation, which still would have been significant, and that passed the House, but then wasn't ultimately included in the final NDAA either. So, this is the second time we've seen something stripped out. Obviously, what happened this year was a huge amount of progress because there was so much more that was included in a version of the NDAA that would have benefited communities. But it's still really disappointing to see this happen again and again. And putting that into the context of, Senator Lujan has been introducing bills to strengthen RICA since he got into the House in 2008. This has been decades now of introducing these same kinds of bills and decades of Congress saying, you have to wait, it's too expensive, push it back. And so at this point, to have that happen when we got so close is pretty devastating. And I think what folks are feeling now is we can't wait any longer. We've heard this too many times, and now this just has to pass. So it's set to expire in June of 2024. So just about, 6 months. When we come back in January, we'll have about 6 months or less than 6 months. And, I think it's really not an option for this program to expire. It would leave so many communities who at least do currently have the ability to apply for compensation and support. It would leave all of those communities with nowhere to turn and no support. And, at least the existing program we've seen does have support in Congress. We were able to pass an extension, a short-term extension 2 years ago, but, that time is up. So I think we would have support for another extension. But what I also am hearing from communities is that it is not enough this year to just do another stopgap extension. We have to be, really looking into significant improvements to the program. These, communities that have been left out are dying. They have been dying, and just kicking the can down the road for another 2 years doesn't really feel like an option this year. So I think that, of course, we'll be working to pass another extension of the program so it doesn't expire. But I think really this time, around, we're feeling like we have to be coupling that extension with these improvements and updates to the program itself. I think, sort of the power of what's been happening over the last few months is this sort of like interesting coalition of bipartisan members of Congress and constituencies coming together. And I think the more members of Congress that are standing up and saying, yes, I support this, the more powerful that coalition gets. I think, it's great to have some sort of big personalities in the room and, this kind of duo of Senator Lujan and Senator Hawley. But we actually want to show that this isn't just these two, outspoken members of Congress. This is, all of Congress. So I think what people can really do to help is to meet with their own members of Congress or call their own members of Congress and really ask them to be more public about their support. I think that's what we've really been urging through the NDAA process is saying, what we really need right now, like this is the moment to stand up and say, I too think that communities cannot wait and should not wait, and we have to do what's right. So, getting those really public statements, I think, is what will help us, make sure that it passes next year, because people will see that it just has such broad support.
Thank you to Mary Dickson and Lilly Adams for joining us on this episode, and for all the important work you have done on this issue and continue to do. And thank you to all the listeners for supporting us through this transformative year. We truly could not do this important work without your continued support and trust, so thank you. And we'll be seeing you in 2024 with our latest season titled Atomic Assembly, which will focus on the construction and deconstruction of U.S. nuclear towns in the atomic age. Stay tuned!
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Angela Kellett and Jacqueline Shing. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.